8. Project Azorian. In April 1968, a Soviet submarine known only as K-129 plunged to the ocean floor off Hawaii. After weeks of searching, USSR officials gave up trying to find it, but several months later, the United States Navy launched a top-secret mission, codenamed Operation Sand Dollar, to find and photograph the wreck. And surprisingly, it took just 3 weeks to locate K-129 at a depth of 16,000 feet, 4,877 meters. 2 years later, in 1970, high-ranking Defense Department and CIA officials embarked on a secret plan to recover the submerged vessel. Dubbed Project Azorian, it was the deepest salvage attempt ever made. At a grand total of around $800 million, equivalent to around $4 billion in modern currency. It was also one of the most expensive and complicated Cold War intelligence undertakings. One of the reasons the expedition was so expensive was because a vessel was built specifically for the mission. As a cover-up, the government claimed that the ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, was built for mining. 2 torpedoes and several other pieces of equipment were recovered from K-129, including code books and other documents that the CIA was presumably thrilled to get their hands on. The team also recovered the remains of 6 Russian service members who'd gone down with the wreck and gave them a proper burial at sea with military honors. In 1975, Time magazine published an expose about the government's true intentions with the mission. Despite the CIA's best efforts to squash the story, the agency remained tight-lipped even after the article came out. Several participants have given interviews over the years, but the exact details of what the mission uncovered are unclear to this day. 7. The fate of Colonel Charles Shelton. United States Air Force pilot Captain Charles Shelton was the last American service member to be officially considered a prisoner of war taken during the Vietnam conflict. He was flying a reconnaissance mission over Laos in 1965 when his plane was shot down by enemy forces. Shelton initially remained in radio contact with the Air Force, but he eventually stopped. Since then, he's only been seen and heard of in an unofficial capacity. In other words, there have been reported sightings of him, but none have been confirmed. Shelton's fate became even more shrouded in mystery during the 1980s, when all the missing Vietnam War soldiers were reclassified as killed in action, or body not recovered. He was the only one who remained missing in action. However, his status was officially changed to killed in action at the request of his family in 1994, although his true fate remains unknown to this day. Some believe Shelton survived and was taken prisoner, yet was never found or accounted for by U.S. forces. Others have speculated that he might have even killed his captor, or that he was alive and well living in America. But if that's not the case, he must have been living under the guise of witness protection. Sadly, not knowing what happened to their loved one took a major toll on Shelton's family, including his wife, who ended her own life 25 years after he initially went missing. 6. Who was Agent 355? During the American Revolution, a group of spies and espionage agents called the Culper Ring operated in and around New York City under the command of a man named Benjamin Tallmadge. Sometimes it was run by George Washington himself, but the Culper Ring's top dog was a farmer from Long Island named Abraham Woodhull, who went by the alias Sam Culper and was a neighbor of Benjamin Tallmadge. Culper and Tallmadge kept Washington informed of their findings through a complex communication network, providing updates about any plans among the British that they found out about. During that time, Woodhull recruited a female secret agent known only as Agent 355, and her identity was never revealed to any other members of the Culper Ring. In the nearly 250 years since, speculation about Agent 355's identity has run rampant, but researchers appear no closer to figuring out who she was than they were back in the 18th century. But some believe that the term Agent 355 may have represented more than one person. What makes the mystery of her identity even more intriguing is the fact that she provided Woodhull with extremely valuable and difficult-to-access information about an American general who was secretly negotiating with the British to hand over the colonial stronghold at West Point. She also warned the Americans of plans among the British to produce counterfeit colonial currency and to attack French troops in Newport, Rhode Island. Agent 355 stopped reporting to the Culper Ring in 1780. Some historians believe she was captured by the British, while others have speculated that she may have even given birth aboard a British ship. But all experts can do for now is guess, and Agent 355's identity, or identities, remain a mystery to this day. What are your theories about the identity of Agent 355? Let us know in the comments below. 5. What happened to POW John Dunn? When the armistice that brought the Korean War to a standstill was signed in 1953, 23 American prisoners of war refused repatriation to the United States. They were from a larger POW group that the Chinese called progressives, and their denouncement of U.S. involvement in the Korean War was most definitely considered treason. Under its legal definition, treason is punishable by death. Some POWs went as far as participating in propaganda films, snitching on fellow detainees, and willingly wearing the enemy's uniform. When the armistice was reached, the 23 prisoners who didn't want to return to America were held in neutral zones. They were allowed to change their mind, though, and 2 of them did. Even most of the dissidents who settled in China, known as turncoats, eventually returned to America. However, 2 men stayed in China permanently, but occasionally visited the U.S. But one man, John Dunn, never returned to the States even for a visit. Writing for The New Yorker, Brandon McNally described Dunn as a mysterious character who left China in 1959 for a new life in Czechoslovakia with his wife, who was believed to be a diplomat. And Dunn was never seen or heard from again, at least as far as anyone in the US knows. Dunn is even absent from footage that features the other 22 POWs who stayed behind in China. In 2013, a researcher discovered that Dunn was on file with a secret communist Czech police agency called the STB. The file was found in a database that was managed in central Slovakia, and while its details are sparse, it provides more information than researchers previously knew about Dunn. One of the biggest surprises was that his wife wasn't a diplomat, but a student. She was from a family that was very involved with the communist movement, but her individual power within the group waned after she married an American man. Even though Dunn was a defector, the Czech communists were still highly suspicious of him. They didn't trust him, which indicates that he may not have been the high-profile traitor spy that he was thought to be until the discovery of the file. In fact, his life wasn't only ordinary, but rather uneventful. He didn't speak the Slovakian language and therefore couldn't find a job. He and his wife had 4 kids, yet lived in a single-room apartment. Even after he finally scored work at a brick factory, he was under the constant watchful eye of the secret police, despite the fact that agents never found any damning evidence against him. 4. Flying Tiger Line Flight 739. During the early stages of the Vietnam War, the U.S. military chartered a Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation propliner to carry 93 American Army Ranger specialists and 3 Vietnamese soldiers from Travis Air Force Base in California to Saigon, Vietnam. Known as the Flying Tiger Flight 739, the aircraft stopped to refuel in Guam, then departed for Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Along the way, the plane vanished without sending any distress calls, prompting one of the biggest sea and air searches in the history of the Pacific. After 8 days passed with no sign of the missing aircraft or anyone on it, the search was called off. A civilian claimed to have seen what looked like an in-flight explosion on the night the aircraft disappeared, but their report didn't help to keep the search going. To this day, nobody knows what became of Flying Tiger Line Flight 739. The plane took off from Guam with 9 full hours worth of fuel, which should have been plenty enough to reach the Philippines with. In an investigation report, the Civilian Aeronautics Board, CAB, concluded that the aircraft likely exploded in flight due to an unknown cause. Sadly, that's the only amount of closure authorities have been able to offer the surviving loved ones of the people who disappeared. But what do you think happened to Flying Tiger Line Flight 739? Let us know in the comments below. But first, be sure to subscribe. 3. The Gray Ghost of the Confederacy. Commander John Singleton Mosby led the 43rd Battalion of the Confederate Army, better known as Mosby's Rangers. Based in north-central Virginia, the unit was notorious for its ability to carry out lightning-fast raids and to elude Union troops by disappearing into thin air and then blending in seamlessly with locals. Most of Mosby's 29 men had no previous military experience, yet they became known as some of the quickest and cleverest soldiers of the American Civil War. In 1863, Mosby and his Rangers captured 58 horses, a Union general, 2 captains, and 30 enlisted soldiers without firing a single shot. Mosby's impressive stealth eventually earned him the nickname of the Gray Ghost of the Confederacy. In addition to his stellar hiding abilities, he was extremely resilient, and on one occasion, he returned to the battlefield just a month after taking a bullet to the groin. But Mosby's worst wartime injury came when a Union soldier shot him through the window of a home where he was eating. A doctor declared the wound mortal. Yet Mosby recovered and returned to fighting just 2 months later. The Union became desperate to get its hands on Mosby, so much so that a $5,000 bounty was offered on his head, roughly the equivalent of $90,000 in modern currency. Even with so many people after him, however, Mosby managed to evade capture. His enemies were dumbfounded, and they simply couldn't figure out the secret behind his vanishing acts. Even when they were hot on his trail, he somehow seemed to magically slip out of sight. Mosby was one of the last members of the Confederacy to surrender. After the war, he became friends with his former enemy, Ulysses S. Grant. The cunning ex-commander went on to serve as the American consul to Hong Kong and also worked for the Department of Justice. Then, at the age of 82, he passed away in 1916. 2. Who burned New York City to the ground? During his first military campaign in the summer of 1776, George Washington was tasked with defending New York City against the British Army, which was considerably larger, better organized, better equipped, and much more experienced than the colonial army. Desertion, disease, and defeat pushed Washington's troops back into New Jersey as his forces grew increasingly weak. Shortly before their withdrawal, someone burned a large portion of Manhattan to the ground. At the time, the Big Apple occupied the southern tip of the island. The city was a mere fraction of its modern-day size. Roughly 1/3 of its buildings were destroyed in the fire, which started on the night of September 20th and continued into the next morning. There are varying accounts of who started the fire and how, from both British and colonial witnesses, but none of them corroborate one another. According to an American prisoner, the fire began inside a tavern in Whitehall, and records show that British commander Sir William Howe immediately suspected arson. The British then proceeded to arrest and question more than 200 civilians about the fire. Some colonists believe the blaze was set deliberately, pointing out that it seemed to start in multiple locations at the same time. And it's on record that Washington discussed the possibility of destroying the city during a meeting with the Continental Congress. In his mind, burning down the Big Apple was a better alternative to leaving it in the hands of the British. And while the idea was ultimately shot down, the fact that it happened so shortly after the meeting led to suspicions that Washington allowed the plan to go forward, while conveniently turning a blind eye to it. Either way, no official explanation for the fire was ever offered, leaving its cause a mystery to this day. 1. Who killed Trinh Minh Thé? In 1951, when Vietnam was under French colonial control, a Vietnamese military leader named Trinh Minh Thé defected from the French army, along with thousands of supporters. His plan was to form a new military called the Union of Nationalist Forces of Vietnam. This new army would fight against both communist and colonial forces. Trinh Minh Thé's military vision was cut short 4 years later in 1955, when a sniper shot and killed him on a street in Saigon in broad daylight. To this day, the sniper's identity remains a mystery. At the time of his death, it's said that Thé was under pressure to join forces with the South Vietnamese army, and that he was considering caving into the urge to combine power. If that had happened, the outcome of the Vietnam War may have been much different because it would have given the South Vietnamese army much more manpower. But it's not necessarily regrettable that it didn't happen, because, as most people agree, the West should have simply stayed out of Vietnam, period.
7. Titan. On June 18, 2023, an experimental submersible called the Titan lost contact with its mother vessel, the Canadian-flagged Polar Prince, during its descent to the Titanic wreckage site. As you may have already gathered from recent news reports, tragedy followed. There were 5 people aboard the 22-foot-long carbon fiber and titanium craft. Billionaire British businessman and explorer Hamish Harding, prominent Pakistani businessman Shahzada Dawood and his 19-year-old son Suleiman, French maritime expert Paul-Henri Nargeolet, who'd made upwards of 35 previous visits to the wreck site, and Stockton Rush, the founder and chief executive of OceanGate Expeditions. Around 10:45 a.m., less than 2 hours into its journey, the Titan suddenly lost contact with the Polar Prince. Nearly 8 hours later, the Polar Prince notified the Coast Guard that the Titan was overdue on its return to the water's surface. A massive international search effort ensued. 2 days later, a banging sound picked up by sonar offered hope that the people aboard the Titan were still alive. But as the hours continued to pass with no sign of the Titan, those searching faced the unsettling truth that it would have run out of oxygen. One way or another, there were likely no survivors. After more than 3 days of searching, a debris field containing pieces of the Titan was spotted on the ocean floor near the Titanic wreck. The submersible had imploded under the immense pressure of the surrounding water, instantly killing everyone aboard. It most likely happened at the same time the vessel lost contact with the Polar Prince. Based in Everett, Washington, OceanGate is a private company that hosts expeditions to shipwrecks and other difficult-to-access sites at the bottom of the ocean. Its approach to deep-water exploration is largely experimental and has garnered widespread criticism in recent years. In fact, it didn't seem to come as a major surprise to many industry experts when the Titan suddenly went missing. Prior to the recent ill-fated expedition, OceanGate claimed that the Titan was the world's only crewed submersible that was capable of taking 5 people to depths of 13,100 feet. But leaders in submersible development feared that it wasn't safe. It could even be said that they foresaw potential disaster. In a 2018 letter obtained by the New York Times, more than 36 respected members of the industry warned of the potential for catastrophic problems. But Stockton Rush believed in his vision, and he was convinced that the Titan was safe enough to begin offering tourist expeditions to the Titanic wreck in 2021 for a hefty price of $250,000 apiece. And while those who chose to take the plunge were required to sign an extensive waiver detailing the myriad of things that could go wrong, the disaster has raised major concerns about OceanGate's decision to offer trips to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean on an uncertified vessel. There are also widespread allegations that the Titan had identifiable safety issues prior to the ill-fated plunge. Numerous people who either completed the voyage or were scheduled to go on expeditions that were cancelled have come forward since the disaster with concerning claims about the submersible's seaworthiness or lack thereof. These accounts include reports of communication failures and navigation malfunctions. 42-year-old Discovery Channel cameraman Brian Weed told NBC News that things immediately went wrong during a test dive aboard the Titan in May 2021. He described the launch of the vessel as clumsy and said that the submersible's propulsion system malfunctioned just a quarter of the way into the dive. According to Weed, the Titan ultimately had to surface due to the problems it was experiencing, and he seemed worried by the fact that the hatch was bolted from the outside, making it essentially impossible for those on the inside to do much in the event of an emergency. Weed said he received an invitation to dive again a week later and turned it down. Weed's concerns echoed the sentiments of 22-year-old Colin Taylor, who described the Titan's communication system as very difficult. While Taylor was lucky enough to complete his mission to the Titanic, unlike many others who wanted but never got the chance, he said that the communication system was text-based, two-way, and very slow. and at least one former OceanGate employee has raised the alarm regarding the integrity of the materials that were used to build the Titan. In court papers from 2017, former OceanGate pilot David Lockridge accused the company of failing to properly test the Titan's carbon fiber shell to ensure it could withstand the water pressure at the extreme depths its builders planned to travel to. Even though the worst possible news has been delivered following the recent disaster, the investigation into the wreck itself and the alleged wrongdoings leading up to it continues. 6. Trapped in the Titanic's propeller. Back in 2000, Michael Guillen joined an expedition to the Titanic wreckage site aboard a Russian submarine. As the vessel navigated toward the ship's massive 21-ton brass propeller, Guillen was shocked at how shiny it still was after spending so many years languishing at the bottom of the dark and frigid North Atlantic. But his awe was short-lived before fascination turned to fear. The submarine was being pushed by a current, causing it to become caught in the propeller. At the time, Guillen was a correspondent for ABC News. The camera was rolling as the sub struck the propeller, causing a large amount of debris to fall all over the vessel. Guillen later told Sky News that he immediately thought, "This is how it's going to end for you." He further explained that the scientist in him forced him to accept that death was a real possibility, while brainstorming for a realistic solution to the crisis at hand. For a half hour, the submarine pilot tried backing out from under the propeller, but with no luck. Meanwhile, Guillen's fears of possibly dying continued to sneak up on him. Finally, after 2 hours, the pilot managed to free the sub, and the crew safely made the 2-hour ascent to the ocean's surface. To this day, Guillen says that the close call nearly cost him his life. Following the disappearance of the OceanGate Titan submersible in 2023, the scientists called for an end to so-called joyrides down to the Titanic wreckage, which he believes could be at least partially accomplished through heightened restrictions. If it was safe and possible, would you want to visit the Titanic wreck site? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 5. The rescue of Roger Mallinson and Roger Chapman. Built in Canada during the late 1960s, the 20-foot-long submersible Pisces 3 showed some troubling signs right from the beginning. It sank during trials in Vancouver Bay in 1971, and the crew had to be rescued by the Canadian Ministry of Defence. But it went on to perform hundreds of successful dives, washing away any fears that something catastrophic might happen in the near future. 2 years after sinking the first time, the tiny 6-foot diameter sub plunged 1,600 feet to the seabed off the Irish coast. At the time, the vessel was on a routine dive to lay transatlantic telephone cables roughly 150 miles southeast of Cork. It was being piloted by 28-year-old former British Royal Navy submariner Roger Chapman and 35-year-old engineer Roger Mallinson, both of whom were experienced with navigating the submersible. They worked their 8-hour shift as scheduled and were about to be lifted back to the surface via a tow rope that was attached to the Pisces 3's mothership when a hatch to the rear compartment broke off. The compartment filled with water, and the tow rope connecting the sub to its mothership snapped, sending the submersible plummeting to the sea bottom at 40 miles per hour. It landed nearly upside down. As soon as they realized something was wrong, the men cut off the vehicle's electrical systems, leaving them in total darkness. Mallinson and Chapman spent the next 3 days trapped, while rescuers raced against the clock to try saving them before they ran out of oxygen. Knowing their oxygen reserves were extremely limited, they exerted as little energy as possible, even avoiding conversation as they waited. Under normal operating conditions, the Pisces 3's crew would turn on a fan every 40 minutes to release built-up carbon dioxide from the vessel. To conserve oxygen, Mallinson and Chapman waited longer than usual to do this, causing them to become drowsy and lethargic. All they had to eat was a lemonade and a sandwich. Before the dive, Mallinson had taken an extra bottle of oxygen. He credited this decision with saving both his and Chapman's lives. After waiting 84 hours and with just a 12-minute supply of oxygen left, the Pisces 3 was pulled to the surface. To this day, it remains the deepest successful underwater rescue in world history. In addition to his decision to bring an extra bottle of oxygen on the dive, Mallinson credited the camaraderie between him and Chapman with helping them survive. They worked well together and did what was necessary to stay alive, and they might not have made it as long as they did if they'd not been able to cooperate so well with one another. Speaking with the Daily Mirror after the disappearance of the Titan submersible in June 2023, at the age of 85, Mallinson said that there's always hope. Of course, at the time, the search for the Titan was ongoing. In another interview with Sky News, Mallinson described the ordeal as horrendous, adding that he couldn't understand why the Titan's crew hadn't tried to transmit some sort of signal to its surface vessel. Unfortunately, we now know that it's because the submersible imploded, giving them absolutely no hope of survival. 4. S-48 wreck. Built in Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1920 for the US Navy, the 240-foot-long submarine USS S-48 experienced a long service life lasting several decades. It even survived World War II before being decommissioned for a third time and finally retired for good. S-48's successes are somewhat surprising considering a nearly catastrophic accident it experienced before it was commissioned for the first time. During a Navy trial run in Long Island Sound on the morning of December 7, 1921, someone left a manhole unsecured, causing several of the sub's compartments to flood with tons of seawater. By the time the crew noticed the problem and manually closed the ballast valves, it was too late to avoid what was about to happen. The vessel sank a few miles off the Fairfield coast, plummeting 80 feet to the bottom of the Atlantic with 41 sailors aboard. Workers for the company that built the submarine, the Lake Torpedo Boat Company, received no radio communications from the stranded crew, who had no way to call for help. To make matters worse, nobody had witnessed S-48 sinking. They were left on their own to either figure out a solution to their predicament or perish. Inside the submarine, the trapped men breathed as lightly as possible to conserve oxygen as they assessed the situation and tried to formulate a plan of action. By then, the lights had gone out and the sub's electrical motors had failed, leaving the crew stranded in the darkness until an electrician on board managed to save the power from failing completely. S-48 continued to take on water, but the sailors kept two of the pumps working for the time being. It was a temporary solution, however, and the crew knew that the pumps would only be able to tirelessly battle against the constant influx of water for so long before they most likely stopped working. Things took a hopeful turn when the ship's commander, Captain Joseph Elliot Austin, and Lieutenant Commander Huss realized that their best hope of survival was to get the vessel's bow to stick up out of the water. That way, someone would see it, and the crew would be able to allow fresh air in by opening the torpedo tubes. The crew cut the anchors and released thousands of pounds of oil into the surrounding water to lighten the bow. When a half hour went by with no progress, the sailors then proceeded to empty 8 tons of water from the vessel by hand, scooping it out little by little with coffee mugs and feeding it to the section of the boat that was pumping out water. Meanwhile, crew members moved any items and fixtures they possibly could to the stern to further decrease the bow's weight. About 45 minutes after the sinking, a poisonous chlorine agent began pouring into the submarine, courtesy of salt water poisoning the sub's sulfuric acid batteries. To prevent the gas from suffocating everyone aboard, the sailors fought to lower the water levels in an effort to keep the seawater from continuing to touch the batteries. When S-48 failed to reach New London as scheduled 4 hours after the sinking, naval personnel and workers from the Lake Torpedo Boat Company launched a search. To prevent panic, they carried out the effort in secret without informing the crew members' family. But it would be another 4 hours before the ship's bow finally pierced the water's surface and became visible. A torpedo man aboard the vessel named Pete Red Dunn volunteered to crawl up through one of the narrow torpedo tubes to hopefully signal for help. The idea was initially considered too dangerous, but with the crew's lives increasingly at risk, time was of the essence. Dunn made it out, but was greeted by rough seas. The men worked in shifts, with a few shimmying up the tube at a time and attempting to flag down any nearby passing ships. They eventually caught the attention of a tugboat, and all 41 sailors were saved. The S-48 was raised 13 days later and underwent repairs. It was commissioned in October 1922 and went on to enjoy a lengthy service life for the US military. 3. AS-28. The Soviet-built mini-submarine and deep submergence rescue vehicle AS-28 entered service during the late 1980s. While investigating an underwater surveillance antenna off the Kamchatka Peninsula with a crew of 7 sailors aboard in 2005, the vessel became entangled in some equipment and got dragged down to the sea bottom. Stuck at a depth of 620 feet, it was impossible for the crew members to abandon the sub and swim to the surface. To conserve oxygen, the crew put on thermal suits and shut down all non-essential systems, including the mini-sub's heater. They spent the next 3 days trapped in the submarine, and as their oxygen supply grew perilously thin, they became increasingly convinced that they were going to die. The sailors even wrote goodbye letters to their loved ones in the dark, frigid vessel, as the unthinkable started to seem all too realistic. But they held out what little hope they could. Upon learning of the sinking, several countries immediately offered help, including Japan, the United States, and Great Britain. A British robotic vehicle managed to free the sub by cutting the cables that were trapping it. These diligent efforts narrowly spared the lives of everyone aboard, with just 4 to 6 hours worth of oxygen left. After surfacing, the sailors all emerged from the AS-28 without assistance, but they reportedly looked dazed and had bloodshot eyes. Speaking with the press following the rescue, one crew member said he couldn't describe how cold it felt aboard the stranded vessel. A subsequent investigation found that the Russian Navy may have initially refused to try rescuing AS-28 due to concerns that doing so would damage the underwater antenna that the submarine was investigating when it got stuck. It would be accurate to say that a complete tragedy was avoided by just a slim margin. 2. USS Thresher. Named after the Thresher family of sharks, the nuclear-powered attack submarine USS Thresher met a catastrophic end despite never seeing combat. Built for the US Navy during the late 1950s and early 60s, it was designed to find and destroy Soviet submarines. In addition to being the fastest and quietest submarine of its time, the 279-foot-long vessel had the most advanced weapon system, including state-of-the-art sonar that was capable of detecting enemy submarines from an unprecedented distance. Starting in 1961, the Thresher underwent extensive sea trials in the Caribbean Sea and elsewhere throughout the Western Atlantic. 2 years later, in 1963, the sub departed Kittery, Maine to carry out dive trials roughly 220 miles off Cape Cod. It performed well during its initial descent, halfway to its 1,300-foot test depth, where it remained overnight. During the submarine's deep dive trial the next morning, it stopped every 100 feet to check the integrity of its operating systems. As the Thresher approached its test depth, communications with the nearby submarine rescue ship Skylark quickly became garbled and then dropped entirely. The Skylark sonar soon showed the Thresher breaking apart as it sank to the ocean floor. It was the first nuclear submarine to be lost at sea. All 129 crew members died, making it the second deadliest submarine disaster on record. An investigation found that a leak in an engine room joint triggered the failure of critical electrical systems, rendering the subsurfacing equipment inoperable. Following the disaster, the Navy implemented major changes in its safety protocols through the establishment of a new quality assurance program called SubSafe. If anything good came of the tragedy, it was the rigorous standards that were put in place to prevent a similar disaster from ever happening again. 1. USS Squalus. The American submarine that eventually became known as the USS Sailfish was originally named the USS Squalus. Built at the Portsmouth Navy Yard in New Hampshire during the late 1930s, the diesel-electric vessel experienced a terrifying accident early on in its career. After undergoing an overhaul, the sub began a series of test dives off the Isles of Shoals on May 12, 1939. The Squalus successfully completed 18 dives before setting out for its 19th on May 23rd. During the outing, the submarine experienced an engine failure, which caused its main induction valve to fail, which means that it was failing to let in fresh air while the ship navigated on the surface. The malfunction caused the aft torpedo room and crew quarters to flood, instantly killing 26 sailors. 33 surviving crew members, including 32 military members and 1 civilian, sprang into action and managed to prevent any more deaths. But there was nothing they could do to stop the Squalus from plunging 243 feet to the bottom of the Atlantic. To signal that the ship was in distress, the crew sent up a marker buoy and set off smoke bombs. Luckily, Navy personnel aboard the submarine USS Sculpin saw the smoke and responded quickly. More help was dispatched to the site and rescue operations began the next morning. While divers and submarine experts worked to save the crew, surviving sailors used hammers to strike the hull, communicating with their rescuers using Morse code. The men were getting cold, and poisonous chlorine gas began to fill the vessel as a result of seawater coming into contact with some of its batteries. Thankfully, rescue crews acted just in the nick of time. Using a rescue chamber, the survivors were brought to the surface in 4 separate trips, consisting of 28 enlisted men, 3 officers, and 1 civilian. They were transported to the shore in 2 separate trips. The rescue chamber made a 5th and final descent to confirm that all the men in the aft chamber had perished. Over the next 113 days, the Navy worked to salvage the Squalus. It finally returned to port in September of that year, 4 months after the sinking, and was subsequently decommissioned. The ship was recommissioned the USS Sailfish in May of 1940 after undergoing repairs. In January 1940, the 4 Navy divers who worked to rescue the survivors were awarded with the Medal of Honor for their life-saving bravery, which involved diving under the most hazardous conditions.
Number 8. Okunoshima, the Island of Contrasts. If you visit Okunoshima, a small island in Japan's inland sea, you'll be greeted by hundreds of friendly rabbits. They'll come to you for food and cuddles, and you'll feel like you're in a fairy tale. But this island is not all sunshine and rainbows. It also has a dark and tragic history, one that involves secret weapons of mass destruction and thousands of innocent lives lost. During World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army built a poison gas factory on Okunoshima, producing thousands of tons of mustard gas, phosgene, and other lethal chemicals. The factory was so secret that the island was removed from all maps and the workers were sworn to secrecy. The poison gas was used against Chinese soldiers and civilians in the war in China, killing about 80,000 people by some estimates. The factory was closed after the war and the Americans destroyed most of the poison gas and equipment. However, some remnants of the factory still remain on the island, such as abandoned buildings, power plants, and storage facilities. There is also a museum that shows the history of poison gas production and its victims. But how did the rabbits get there? Some people think that they were descendants of the rabbits that were used to test the poison gas during the war. However, most experts disagree with this idea, saying that the original rabbits were all killed by the Americans. Instead, they believe that the rabbits came from a group of 8 bunnies that were released by some school kids in 1971. With no predators or hunting on the island, the rabbits multiplied quickly and became a tourist attraction. Today, Okunoshima is an island of contrasts, where cute bunnies live with a grim past. It is an island where visitors can enjoy nature and wildlife, but also learn about the horrors of war and chemical weapons. It is an island where life and death are intertwined. Number 7. La Merced. La Merced is a 4-masted vessel that was built in 1917. It served as an auxiliary schooner during World War I, a lumber and oil trader, and a floating cannery in Alaska. The ship was salvaged in 1965 and moved to Loverick Shipyard in Anticords, Washington, where it was stripped of its mast, propellers, engines, and deck fittings. The owner of the shipyard, Anton Lovric, had the creative idea to use the ship as a breakwater to protect the marina from waves and storms. He filled the hull with sand and rocks and placed it in position in 1966. Since then, La Merced has been overtaken by nature, as trees have grown from the sand-filled hull and on the deck. The ship is now a forested island that contrasts with the surrounding water and boats. The trees are mostly alders, maples, and cottonwoods, and they provide habitats for birds, squirrels, and insects. The ship also attracts photographers and tourists who are fascinated by the sight of a historic vessel reclaimed by nature. La Merced was one of the few remaining four-masted schooners in the world, and it was placed on the National Historic Register in 1990. The ship is a testament to the maritime history and culture of the region, as well as the ingenuity and resourcefulness of its owner. La Merced is also a reminder of how nature can transform human-made objects over time, creating forms of beauty and wonder. Number 6. Ta Prohm. Ta Prohm is one of the most famous and atmospheric temples in the Angkor region of Cambodia. Built in the late 12th and early 13th centuries by King Jayavarman VII, it was originally built as a Buddhist monastery and center of learning dedicated to his mother. The temple was home to more than 12,500 people, including priests, dancers, and workers. Unlike most of the other temples in Angkor, Ta Prohm was left largely untouched by the restoration efforts of the 20th century. As a result, it has been swallowed by the jungle, with trees growing out of the ruins and roots wrapping around the walls and towers. The temple looks very much the way it did when European explorers first discovered it in the 19th century. Ta Prohm is a temple of mystery and beauty, where nature and human artistry blend together in a harmonious and haunting way. The temple has a maze-like layout with courtyards, corridors, and galleries that are often blocked by piles of stones or roots. The bas-reliefs on the walls depict scenes from Buddhist mythology and history, as well as everyday life in ancient Cambodia. Some of the most iconic images of Ta Prohm are the giant trees that dominate the temple. The silk cotton trees and strangler figs have grown over and through the structures, creating a surreal and stunning sight. Some of the trees have been removed to prevent further damage to the temple, but many remain as a testament to the power and resilience of nature. Ta Prohm is a popular destination for tourists and filmmakers alike. It was featured in the 2001 movie Lara Croft: Tomb Raider starring Angela Jolie. The temple is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, along with the other monuments of Angkor. Ta Prohm is a must-see for anyone who wants to experience the magic and mystery of Cambodia's ancient past. Number 5. Villa Apesuen. Villa Apesuen was a tourist village in Argentina that was famous for its salt lake with healing properties. The lake was so salty that it was second only to the Dead Sea in salt content. People suffering from various ailments came to soak in its waters and enjoy the resort town that had hotels, spas, restaurants, and shops. The village was founded in the 1920s and it reached its peak of popularity in the 1950s and 1970s, when it could accommodate up to 5,000 visitors at a time. It was accessible from Buenos Aires by train and had 2 railway stations. However, in 1985, a rare weather pattern caused a seiche, or a standing wave in the lake, which broke a nearby dam and dike that protected the village. The water gradually rose but relentlessly until it submerged the entire village under more than 33 feet of salt water. The villagers had to evacuate and leave behind their homes and businesses. The village remained underwater for 25 years until 2009, when the water level started to drop due to drier weather. Today, Villa Apesuen is a ghost town that has been reclaimed by nature. The salt water has left a white and gray layer over the ruins of the buildings, which have been corroded and decayed by the harsh environment. The trees have died and become bare skeletons. The streets are covered with mud and debris. Only one resident, Pablo Novak, who was born in 1930, returned to his home in 2009 and lives there alone. Villa Apesuen has become a tourist attraction again, but for a different reason. It is a place of haunting beauty and mystery, where nature has shown its power to erase human civilization. Have you or would you like to visit Villa Apesuen? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 4. SS Airfield. If you visit Homebush Bay, a suburb of Sydney, Australia, you might be surprised to see a shipwreck covered with lush greenery floating in the water. This is the SS Airfield, a century-old freighter that has become a natural wonder and a popular attraction for locals and tourists alike. The SS Airfield, a steam collier, was built in the UK in 1911 and registered there in 1912. It was used to transport coal, oil, and water supplies during World War II. In 1972, it was retired and sent to Homebush Bay, which was then a shipbreaking yard. However, for some unknown reason, the SS Airfield and 3 other ships were never dismantled and were left to rust in the bay. Over time, nature took over the abandoned vessel and transformed it into a floating forest. The hull of the ship became a fertile ground for mangrove trees, which sprouted from the cracks and crevices in the metal. The branches of the trees spilled over the sides of the ship, creating a striking contrast between the rusted steel and the vibrant green. The SS Airfield is now one of the most remarkable sights in Homebush Bay, which was once a polluted industrial area but has since been redeveloped into a residential and commercial district after hosting the 2000 Olympic Games. The shipwreck is also a testament to the resilience of nature and its ability to reclaim what humans have abandoned. The SS Airfield is also known as the Floating Forest, a fitting name for this unique fusion of man-made and nature elements. The SS Airfield can be seen from land or from a boat. It is especially beautiful at sunset when the lights reflect off the water and the foliage. Many photographers and visitors flock to Homebush Bay to capture this amazing sight. The SS Airfield is not only a historical relic, but also a living art piece that inspires awe and wonder. Number 3. The Lost City of Petra. Petra is a prehistoric city carved into the sandstone cliffs of southwest Jordan by the Nabatean people, who ruled a trading empire between 400 BC and AD 106. Petra was hidden from the Western world for hundreds of years, until it was rediscovered by a Swiss explorer in 1812. Petra is one of the 7 wonders of the modern world and a World Heritage Site, known for its stunning architecture and cultural heritage. Petra is also linked to Arab tradition as the place where Moses struck a rock and water came forth and where his sister Miriam is buried. One of the most striking features of Petra is how it was taken over by nature after its decline and abandonment. The Wadi Ems, the Valley of Moses, which supplied the residents with water and irrigation, cut the city's terrace from east to west where it was established. However, changing trade routes and frequent earthquakes caused Petra to lose its economic and political importance, and by the 7th century AD, it was largely deserted. The sandstone cliffs that once protected the city from invaders also concealed it from sight, and the elements gradually eroded and weathered the buildings and monuments. The colors of the rocks changed from a vibrant red, white, pink, and sandstone to pale yellow and brown, blending in with the desert landscape. Today, Petra is a popular tourist destination that attracts visitors from all over the world. They can explore the ancient city by walking through a narrow gorge called the Siq, which leads to the majestic treasury, a temple carved into the rock face. They can also see other remarkable structures such as tombs, temples, churches, palaces, and an amphitheater that testified to the rich history and culture of Petra. However, they can also witness how nature has reclaimed its territory as plants, animals, and insects have made their homes among the ruins. Some of the buildings are covered with vines, mosses, and flowers, while others are inhabited by birds, bats, lizards, and spiders. The contrast between human-made and natural elements creates a unique and fascinating sight that inspires awe and wonder. Number 2. The green ghost town of Hutuan. Imagine a village where the houses are draped in green curtains of plants. The streets are silent except for the sounds of birds and insects, and the only visitors are curious explorers and photographers. This is Hutuan, a village on Shengshan Island in the East China Sea that was once home to more than 2,000 fishermen and their families. Hutuan was a prospering fishing village in the 1980s, but it faced many difficulties in the 1990s. The fish stocks dwindled, the transportation became inconvenient, and the living conditions became poor. The villagers had no access to education, healthcare, or other services. They decided to leave their homes and move to other places where they could find better opportunities and a better quality of life. By the early 2000s, Hutuan was almost completely abandoned. But nature did not forget Hutuan. It embraced the empty village and turned it into a green paradise. Plants grew over the buildings, windows, and doors, creating a natural camouflage and stunning scenery. Animals returned to the village and made it their habitat. Butuan became a hidden treasure for those who wanted to witness its surreal beauty and learn about its fascinating history. Butuan is a unique example of how nature can reclaim human spaces and create its own harmony. It's also a reflection of the challenges and changes that rural communities face in the modern world. Butuan is not just a village, but also a story of adaptation and transformation. And at number 1, France's secret car graveyard. Somewhere in a tiny village in France, there is a hidden treasure for car enthusiasts. A secret junkyard with over 500 cars from the 1920s and 1930s. Some of them are rare and valuable models. The exact location of this car graveyard is a mystery, and only a few people know how to find it. The owner of the land does not allow visitors or photographers and has refused to sell any of the cars. The origin of this car collection is also unknown, but some speculate that it belonged to a wealthy businessman who had a passion for vintage cars. He bought them from all over Europe and stored them on his property, hoping to restore them someday. However, he died before he could fulfill his dream, and his heirs did not share in his interests. They left the cars to rot on the land, exposed to the elements and the passage of time. Over the decades, nature has reclaimed its territory, and the cars have become part of the landscape. They are covered in vines, mosses, and flowers, creating a striking contrast with the metal and glass. Some of them are barely recognizable, while others still retain some of their original charm and elegance. They're like frozen sculptures that evoke nostalgia and curiosity. The secret junkyard in France is a unique and fascinating place that attracts the attention of car lovers and adventurers. However, it is also a place of decay and neglect, where history and beauty are slowly fading away. It's a reminder of how nature can transform human objects over time, creating new forms of art and wonder. Thanks for watching. Which one of these places would you like to visit the most? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.